A city dies in seconds, not from war, not from famine, not from the slow rot of empire. It dies from the sky. In 2021, a team of scientists published a paper that had spent years in peer review, not because the data was flawed, but because the implications were too large to process quickly. They had found, buried beneath a Bronze Age city in the Jordan Valley, a destruction layer unlike anything else in the archaeological record. Temperatures exceeding 3,700 degrees Fahrenheit, melted building materials, scorched human bone, a pressure wave that flattened everything for miles in every direction. The city is called el-Hammam, and almost certainly it is Sodom. For 1,700 years, the church told you what happened here and why. The archaeology tells a different story entirely. To understand what was destroyed, you first have to understand what it was. The Middle Bronze Age Jordan Valley, roughly 1800 to 1600 BC, is one of the most fertile corridors in the ancient Near East. The kicker, the disc-shaped plain at the north end of the Dead Sea, is described in Genesis as well-watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. That is not poetic exaggeration. It is geography. This is a trade corridor, a crossroads, the kind of place that accumulates wealth, population, complexity, and power. El-Hammam sits at the center of it. By Middle Bronze Age standards, this is a major city. The upper tell covers roughly 36 hectares. The lower city, the residential and commercial quarters, extends the site to somewhere near 100 hectares at its peak occupation. It has monumental architecture. A massive mud brick rampart, in some places 15 meters high, encircles the upper city. There is a palace complex, administrative buildings, a gateway system that controls movement in and out. This is not a village. This is a city-state, with all that implies: stratified society, a ruling class, a merchant class, and at the bottom, people with no choices at all. The people who live here are traders, farmers, craftspeople. They worship in a tradition older than the texts that will later condemn them. They do not know what is coming, and they have no idea that 2,000 years after their deaths, a religious institution will use the name of their city to justify the persecution of millions. Beat 1. The destruction layer, what the science actually shows. The paper published in 2021 is titled "A Cosmic Airburst Destroyed el-Hammam, a Middle Bronze Age City in the Jordan Valley near the Dead Sea." It appears in the journal Scientific Reports. The lead researcher is Dr. James Kennett of UC Santa Barbara. His team includes over 20 co-authors from disciplines spanning archaeology, geology, mineralogy, physics, and chemistry. What they find in the destruction layer at el-Hammam is not normal. The pottery at the destruction level is not broken. It is vitrified. The surface temperatures required to melt mud brick pottery that has already survived firing, exceed 1,500 degrees Celsius. That is not a house fire. That is not a military assault. That is not a volcanic eruption. They find shocked quartz, a mineral form that only occurs under the kind of sudden, extreme pressure produced by cosmic impact events or nuclear detonation. They find tiny spherules of melted iron and silica, the signature of superheated atmospheric entry. They find elevated iridium, platinum, osmium. These are elements rare in the Earth's crust. They are common in space rocks. The team's reconstruction is as follows. A space rock, most likely a fragmented comet or asteroid, enters the atmosphere above the Jordan Valley at a low angle. It does not impact the ground. It detonates approximately 1 kilometer above the city. The pressure wave and thermal pulse that result are comparable in scale to the 1908 Tunguska event in Siberia, an airburst that flattened 2,000 square kilometers of forest. The difference is that Tunguska hits empty taiga. This one hits a city of perhaps 40,000 people. The city is destroyed in seconds, completely. The destruction layer shows no evidence of a gradual collapse, no evidence of looting, no evidence of post-event habitation. Everyone is simply gone. and the city is abandoned for 500 years. No one comes back to rebuild. No one settles on the ruins. The site, one of the most strategically valuable pieces of real estate in the ancient Near East, sits empty for half a millennium. That fact alone tells you how total the destruction was. The people who survive, the people who flee before it happens, the people far enough away to watch the sky turn white, remember, and they tell the story. Beat 2. The Genesis account, older than you think, and stranger. The Genesis account of Sodom's destruction is not a simple story. It is a layered text assembled from at least 2 older oral traditions, written down over centuries, and shaped by political and theological agendas that have nothing to do with the events it describes. Biblical scholars identify the Sodom narrative as primarily a product of the Yahwist source, the oldest literary layer of the Pentateuch, combined with later priestly additions. The Yahwist material likely dates to the 10th or 9th century BC. That means the story is being written down at least 600 years after the event it describes, which maps almost perfectly onto the dating of the Tall el-Hammam destruction at approximately 1650 BC. What survives in Genesis is the collective memory of a real event, processed through 6 centuries of oral tradition, and filtered through the theological preoccupations of a society constructing a national religious identity. Here is what the Genesis text actually emphasizes about Sodom. The word translated as sin in the phrase the outcry against Sodom, the Hebrew za'aka, is a specific legal term. It is the cry of the oppressed, the plea of the exploited. The specific terminology used elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible for the cry of enslaved Israelites in Egypt. The sin of Sodom, in the oldest stratum of the text, is not what the church later says it is. The prophet Ezekiel, writing in the 6th century BC, states it explicitly. Now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. Ezekiel 16:49. Sodom's sin, in the prophetic tradition, is the sin of a wealthy, powerful city-state that hoards its resources and brutalizes those who come to its gates. That is the tradition that the church buries. Beat 3. The hospitality violation, what the text says before it says anything else. The story in Genesis 19, that the church builds its entire sexual theology around, requires context that the church rarely provides. 2 figures, described as angels, though perceived initially as ordinary travelers, arrive at the gate of Sodom at evening. Lot meets them at the gate and insists they stay at his house rather than sleep in the city square. This detail is not incidental. In ancient Near Eastern culture, hospitality to strangers is not a courtesy. It is a sacred obligation. The stranger at the gate is under the protection of the household that receives them. To violate that protection, to harm a guest, is among the gravest offenses in the social code. The men of Sodom do not simply demand to know the visitors. They surround the house. They demand that Lot hand over his guests. They threaten violence when he refuses. This is a mob asserting the city's right to dominate and humiliate anyone who enters its gates without permission. The Hebrew verb yada, to know, does appear in a sexual sense in some contexts, but it appears far more frequently in the Hebrew Bible simply as to know. Of its 943 appearances in the Hebrew text, 10 carry clear sexual meaning. This is one of the 10. But what the church does with that fact is a different matter entirely. The sexualization of the Sodom story does not happen immediately. For the first several centuries of Christian history, the church fathers read the Sodom story through the lens that Ezekiel provides, as a story about greed, pride, and the abandonment of the vulnerable. But something shifts. In the 6th century AD, a Roman emperor facing military catastrophe needs a scapegoat, and the story of Sodom becomes a weapon. What he builds with it, and how it is used for the next 1400 years, that record exists, and it is worse than the fire. Beat 4. Justinian's edict, how a military disaster became a moral crusade. The year is 538 AD. The Byzantine Emperor Justinian I is one of the most powerful men in the world, and he is losing. A catastrophic plague has swept through the empire. Military campaigns in Italy and North Africa are draining the treasury. Earthquakes have struck Constantinople. The Nile has flooded. A volcanic winter is beginning to descend across the northern hemisphere. Justinian needs an explanation. In 538, and again in 544, Justinian issues imperial edicts blaming a series of catastrophic events on what he calls the pollution of Sodom. The edicts are explicit. They state that God is punishing the empire for the presence of men who engage in sex with other men. The punishment prescribed: confiscation of property, mutilation, public parade through Constantinople, and execution. The primary sources survive. The historian Procopius, writing contemporaneously in his Secret History, documents the enforcement of these edicts in detail. He describes bishops being hauled before tribunals, their property seized, their genitals mutilated in public before crowds assembled to watch. Procopius is not sympathetic to the accused. He is documenting state power performing itself through the bodies of the condemned. This is the moment when the story of Sodom is weaponized, not as theology, not as moral teaching, as emergency political management. A city destroyed by a space rock in 1650 BC becomes, 1400 years later, the justification for mutilating bishops in Constantinople. And the logic, God destroys cities full of sodomites, becomes the operating system of Western moral law for the next millennium. Beat 5. The medieval machinery, from Justinian to the Inquisition. Justinian's edict does not die with his empire, it migrates. Through the penitential literature of the early medieval church, detailed manuals prescribing specific penances for specific sins, the Justinian framework becomes institutionalized. The Penitential of Theodore, compiled in 7th century England, assigns penances of between 3 and 15 years for various categories of same-sex acts, but the machinery does not stop at penance. In 1260, Thomas Aquinas publishes his Summa Contra Gentiles, the systematic theological framework that will dominate Catholic moral teaching until the modern era. Aquinas places sodomy in a specific theological category, vitia contra naturam, crimes against nature. The logic is Aristotelian. Sexual acts that cannot produce children violate the natural order, which is to say, they violate God's design. The circle closes. Sodom, understood through Justinian, understood through Augustine, understood through Aquinas, becomes the theological shorthand for an entire category of human behavior. And the Inquisition, when it consolidates in the 13th and 14th centuries, adds sodomy to its list of prosecutable offenses alongside heresy and witchcraft. The records of the Venetian Council of Ten, available in the Venetian state archives, document sodomy prosecutions running from the 14th century through the 18th. Execution, mutilation, exile, confiscation, all justified by a story about a city that the church never located, whose actual destruction it never explained, and whose biblical condemnation it deliberately and systematically misread. Here is what the Archaeology at el-Hammam actually shows: not about sexuality, not about morality, about what a city is and what it means when one disappears. In the destruction layer, the scientists find human remains, not many. The city had population in the tens of thousands. Almost no bodies are recovered. The thermal pulse from the airburst is sufficient to cremate human remains entirely. But among what is recovered, fragments of bone, teeth, the trauma markers are consistent with extreme, instantaneous heat exposure. These people do not run, they do not flee. The destruction is too fast. Now consider what the church teaches happened here. God looked down on a city, he deliberated. He sent angels to assess the situation. He negotiated with Abraham over the threshold of righteous men required to spare the city. He found the threshold unmet. And then he rained fire and brimstone from the heavens. The church reads this story as an act of divine judgment and uses it to justify, across 14 centuries, the torture and killing of hundreds of thousands of people. What the archaeology shows is a space rock, a random piece of solar system debris, following an orbital path determined by gravity and momentum, that intersected the Earth's atmosphere above the Jordan Valley on a specific day in approximately 1650 BC. No judgment, no deliberation, no threshold of righteousness. A rock. And this is where the history becomes something else entirely. Because the people who survived the destruction of el-Hammam, the people who watched that city disappear in a column of fire and smoke visible for hundreds of miles, those people passed down the story of what they saw. They interpreted it through the only framework available to them, divine will. That interpretation is human. That interpretation is understandable. What is not understandable, what requires a different kind of accounting, is what an institution does with that story 1,000 years later. The church does not inherit a moral truth, that it inherits a trauma memory, a folk account of a natural disaster, and it builds a legal architecture of persecution on top of it. Every man mutilated in Constantinople under Justinian's edict, every person tried by the Inquisition under sodomy, charges. Every execution carried out in the name of Sodom across the medieval and early modern world. All of it rests on a misreading of a document that is itself a 600-year-old folk memory of a space rock hitting a Bronze Age city. The people of el-Hammam had no idea their city would become a moral category. They were just trying to survive in a trade corridor in the Jordan Valley. They did not. Every system of control needs an origin story, a founding crime, a primal violation so severe that the punishment, whatever the punishment is, appears proportionate. The story of Sodom is one of the most efficient origin stories in Western history. It takes the memory of a real catastrophe, assigns a moral explanation, and then uses that explanation to justify centuries of legal violence against a category of people who had nothing to do with what happened in the Jordan Valley in 1650 BC. What el-Hammam tells us is not just the origin of the Sodom story, it tells us how power works. Power does not need to fabricate history from nothing. It only needs to find a real event, a real disaster, a real trauma, a real ruin, and attach the right explanation to it. The explanation does the work. The ruin provides the authority. And the people who actually died there, 40,000 of them, vaporized on a morning in 1650 BC, they become the footnote to someone else's argument. The paper published in 2021 is still being debated. Some archaeologists dispute the el-Hammam Sodom identification. The site's location relative to ancient textual geography is contested, and the evidence, while compelling, stops short of a definitive match. But the destruction event itself is not in dispute. Something destroyed that city, completely. Something so total that nobody went back for 500 years, and whatever it was, it is still sitting in the ground there, waiting for the next team of scientists to dig a little deeper. The church told you. Sodom burned because of what people did in their beds. The ground tells a different story. The ground is usually right. If you want more history they buried, subscribe. New video every day.